A quick note before we begin. Today's podcast about tariffs and foreign exchange rates was recorded on Wednesday, April 30th, 2025. So all information is accurate as of that date. If you'd like to learn more on this topic and how the industry is responding, we have links in the show notes to resources with more information. Thanks for listening, and now on with the show. This is Open Work, a look inside the watch industry, a podcast from Collective Horology. I'm Gabe Riley, co-founder of Collective.
And I'm Asher Apkin, co-founder of Collective. Collective Horology is an independent watch retailer based in Southern California. We carry a wide range of independent brands, including Ming, Fears, Singer Reimagined, and more. To learn more about us and check out our available inventory, visit collectivehorology.com. Hey, Gabe, it's promo time.
Oh, yeah? Well, why don't you do the promo?
Run the promo. As some of you have heard in previous episodes, and if you're on our mailing list, you've gotten the email. On Saturday, June 7th in Hollywood, California, we will be returning for our second open house. Open house is a wonderful event where we will have the full lines and representatives on hand from Chapek, Garrick, Ming, Sartori Biard, Singer Reimagined, Speak Marine, and though he's not a watchmaker, one of our favorite clothing makers locally, Wesley from Standard H. The event is completely free from noon to 6. All you got to do is RSVP. To get more information and to register for the event, just visit collectivehorology.com/open house, and we will see you there.
Looking forward to it. Well, Asher, we're finally doing it. Today is the tariff episode. And
yes.
Oh my, do we have an episode. So look, today we're going to go inside the industry response to the double whammy, not just of tariffs in the United States, but also foreign exchange rates. Both of these things have sort of conspired together to have a major impact on the industry, and we want to talk about both of them. So we're going to do a few things today. First thing we're going to do is address some common myths that we're seeing out there. We've mentioned in the past that there's a lot of basic misinformation about this situation. So we want to address quickly some of those things and get them out of the way. We're going to offer a look behind the scenes at how the industry is responding. I think that's what's going to be different about this episode compared to most of the coverage that you've seen out there about tariffs and watches. Like, we're going to take you behind the scenes in the conversations we're having with brands and other players in the industry to give you an idea of how we're working together to address this. And we're also going to discuss the implications for watchmaking in the United States, because that's certainly a big part of the tariff regime here, or part of the thinking here has a lot to do with industry in the United States. Now,
Well, that's the good faith argument.
Sure, that's one of the arguments out there. I do want to start by saying we acknowledge not all of our listeners are in the United States, and that this is a situation that's obviously clearly grounded in the United States, but it's an important issue for the industry in general. The first thing is the United States represents the single largest market for Swiss watch exports. It's about 17% of the exports in watches, so that's by revenue, are going to the United States. So it's not an insignificant market for the industry. The second thing is that's also in a context where, generally speaking, other markets have been in retreat. So while the US in 2024 was 16.8% of total Swiss watch sales, that was a 5 percentage point increase year over year in a world where exports to most countries were on the decline. So this is a critical market and a growing market for the industry as a whole, and this affects not just people and businesses in the United States, but obviously the industry at large. So with that, let's start just by grounding ourselves quickly in the situation here. What exactly is going on with tariffs, and what exactly is going on with foreign currency exchange rates? Because these two things need to be considered together.
Yeah. So why don't we get started just by doing some basic definitions? First of all, I want to just define what a tariff is and how that differentiates from duties, because they're two different things, and it's important to understand what they are and how they work. So when a product comes into the United States, so when a watch comes into the United States, it is listed on what is called the harmonized code, or it has a harmonized code associated with it, which is a schedule essentially of breakdowns of specific products and their variants. So a wristwatch, automatic with X number of jewels, etc. A wristwatch of precious metal with a quartz movement.
And this is true for any product.
Yeah.
A baseball cap, a car tire, anything like that has a code that's associated with it and therefore a duty it's assessed.
Yeah, and this, by the way, is true. The reason it's a harmonized code is that those codes are consistent country to country to country. So other countries also import these products, and there needs to be some degree of consistent definition about what somebody is exporting and what somebody is importing. And different countries assess duties on those, and duties can vary significantly in the percentage of the value of the item that is essentially taxed when it comes into the country. But here in the United States, we've enjoyed relatively low duties on watches for an extended period of time. The average duty that we would generally see paid is somewhere between 1.5% to 3%, depending on the composition of the watch, the material used, the movement, etc. Now, a tariff is an additional blanket tax that is charged on the total value, not a component, but the total value of the item being imported. And it's usually specifically targeted at other countries for which, and this is, again, the good faith argument for a tariff, for which a domestic industry may need protection because that third party country is producing something in a way or at a scale or in some way that is imbalanced with the importing country.
Yeah. So a tariff essentially targets a country. A duty targets essentially a product.
Correct.
Right? So there's a duty on watch movements. There's a duty on watch cases depending on their material. And whether you're sending that watch case or movement from China, Switzerland, wherever, the duty is always the same. But
Correct.
A tariff would be applied across all of that at varying levels for varying countries. So right now, 145% if it's coming from China, 10% for the time being if it's coming from any other part of the world.
Yeah. And the thing that's a little unusual about the situation, well, there's many things that are unusual about the situation we're in, but one of them that's particularly unusual is that generally a tariff is focused on a specific industry. So if there's an imbalance, let's say, in automotive imports versus domestically produced automotives, a country may choose to impose tariffs on imported cars explicitly because they want to support domestic business. What's unusual about the situation we're in is that it's everything. It's every product from other countries. So essentially, every product that's being brought into the United States is having somewhere between, currently on this day, 10% up to 145% of its imported value charged as a tariff. Now, tariffs are in addition to duties. So they don't replace each other and they do stack. So what that means is where it would have cost between 1.5% to 3% to import something into the United States, a watch into the United States prior to April 2nd, now the lowest amount of duty and tariff combined that would be paid would be somewhere between 11 and 13%. So it's actually a little bit more than I think some people are considering. But we're going to get into exactly how that's calculated. Before we do it, I think it was just critical to define that. And we would highly recommend, if you really just want to understand the mechanics of all this, that you go watch Teddy Baldesser's incredible video that he released a couple of days ago, where he really gets into like the mechanics of how these things are calculated and does so in a really straightforward way. So respect to Teddy for that incredible piece of content that he made.
Yeah. Can't underscore that enough. We've talked about the challenge of finding accurate information about how these tariffs work, who pays them, the mechanics of it, all that stuff. Check out that video. We'll link it in the show description. The next thing we want to talk about, and this is something that has been, I think, frankly, underreported and is not something that people are discussing, and in many ways is just as significant as these tariffs, is foreign exchange rates. First, let me just say, like, foreign exchange rates, if you're in the United States or you're buying a watch or anything in any country around the world that's coming from somewhere else, foreign exchange rates will always play into.
Yeah, and they're always fluctuating.
The pricing. They're always fluctuating. And in the watch industry, this is something that we look at regularly. Most brands that we work with, we take a look at, and they take a look at their pricing quarterly. And they say, has currency exchange rates moved up or down, and prices can be adjusted accordingly. Most recently, over the last few years, the dollar has been getting weaker relative to most of the currencies that we buy watches in.
Which are Swiss francs and euros primarily, and GBP.
Yep. And so what that means is watches have been getting more expensive here. It takes more dollars to buy that same watch. And that's been a big part of the ongoing price increases we've all talked about. But usually those changes are incremental. There actually was an example a few years ago where we lowered prices. A brand lowered their US MSRP. So a few years ago, there was a bit of a currency hiccup in Great Britain, where the British pound became quite quickly devalued, and fears ended up lowering their U.S. MSRP, and I'm guessing their MSRP in other, the retail price in other countries, because the pound was weaker. Therefore, it took fewer dollars to buy the same watch. So usually it doesn't happen that prices decrease, but it is possible, and it has happened, and I think that's an important
Well, that's also
example.
part of how brands calculate their margin. Some of the points that are in there are to accommodate for currency fluctuation. Sometimes the brand, quote unquote, wins because currency's in their favor, and sometimes in the past, the importer won, if you will, because of those. So there was always a little bit of a push and pull, but you're looking at a couple of points generally, plus or minus.
Yeah, and ongoing fluctuation of currency, yes, is built in to some extent to watch pricing. However, this year, the situation with currency valuations has changed and changed quickly. So year to date, the value of the Swiss franc relative to the dollar has increased 9.23%. So from January 1st to today, we're recording this on April 30th, 2025. That's important given how quickly things are moving. The franc has increased in value, or the purchasing power of the dollar has decreased 9.23%. So it takes more dollars to buy the same item in Swiss francs. Now, that was also exacerbated by the tariff situation. So since April 2nd, when the U.S. tariffs were announced, that rate of change increased dramatically. So since then, the Swiss franc has gotten 6.58% stronger.
Just in April.
Yeah. So year to date, it's about a 9% increase. And in just the last month, it's been nearly 7%. So when we're thinking about tariffs that are 10%, and people understand, I think intuitively, like, wow, that's significant. That adds cost. The currency exchange moving just about 9%, more than 9%, is really just as significant as the tariff situation. And these two things are happening together. And of course, like you said, with tariffs and duties, these situations stack upon each other.
A good that we would have bought at a relatively stable exchange rate for 1.5% to 3% of tax on import now costs us 9%-ish more to buy. And then we now owe an additional 10% of tax on it.
That's right.
So just think about that in any normal day-to-day object that you buy or consume regularly in the way that we regularly import watches. And you can get an idea of the non-trivial impact it has on the cost to land a good. But that said, when this news landed in early April, we started to see all sorts of confusion in the market, which makes a lot of sense because there wasn't a lot of information out there. And watching both what our clients were saying to us, but also comments on various different articles, there were several different myths that started to gel and misconceptions. So we want to bang through a couple of these before we get to how the industry is responding and some actual numbers so that you guys can have an understanding of what this looks like in practice. Because as we'll see from some of these myths, it's not necessarily the way some people have perceived it. So let me start with just the first one, which is the most important thing. There is a myth that the exporter and or the exporting country pays a tariff. That is categorically untrue. It has never been true. There is never a situation where a tariff has been paid by the exporter from a statutory standpoint. And the reason I qualify it that way is that, sure, some brands or some clients will say, sure, we'll land a good to you, consumer, and we'll cover the duties.
Well,
but that is not
an example would be many watch brands have business entities in the U.S. and they will ship the watch from their business entity, say in Switzerland, to the U.S. And that same company.
There are some companies that would even just say, "I'll just eat the 3% and deliver it to you." Back in the
sure,
day,
some would include duties. Yeah.
But my point is, don't misunderstand that. That is a choice a business may have made at that time. It is not a statutory thing. So when we hear people saying this is going to raise revenue for the United States, that is true. But the source of that revenue are American companies and American consumers who pay that duty.
Yeah.
and that tax.
Yeah, and believe me, we have we import 13 different brands, and we have the invoices from U.S. Customs to back it up. We are paying the duties on every watch we bring into this country that is sent to us.
Yeah.
The second one is, it's a related myth. So myth number 2 is this notion that consumers don't pay tariffs if they import. And this was interesting. We had a conversation with a client who was talking to us about buying a watch directly from a brand overseas. And, he mentioned us, well, this works out for me because I won't have to pay the tariffs. That's not true. Now, I think there has been a perception in some cases that people don't have to pay tariffs when they're importing for a couple of reasons. One, Asher, as you mentioned, in the past, some brands have said, hey, the duties are on us. So when they ship the watch, they'll tell DHL, FedEx, UPS, or whomever, you can bill us for the tariffs. Just charge it to our account.
For the duty.
Yeah, for the duty. Yeah, you can bill us for that. We'll cover it. That's been true to some extent. Most brands don't do that, but there are a few that have in the past. The second one is a lot of people buy objects from overseas, items from overseas. So this is kind of like the Temu business model where they buy something and it ships from China and they don't pay an import duty. That's because there's something called a de minimis exemption.
Well,
so
there was.
There still is, but it doesn't apply to China anymore. So the de minimis exemption said basically if you're bringing in less than $800 worth of stuff, it's not worth anyone's time to charge you a duty. This will be familiar to anyone who's traveled internationally. When you're asked to declare what you're bringing back into the United States, it'll ask you, the U.S. Customs form will usually ask you, are you bringing in anything in excess of $800 in value? And if the answer is no, have a nice day. If the answer is yes, you need to declare it and pay a duty and all that kind of stuff. Same thing when shipping items. So I think there's been this perception, when I've ordered stuff from overseas, I haven't been hit with duties in any way, shape, or form. I won't be now. If you are ordering something that is over $800 in value, you will almost certainly be responsible for paying the duties. This isn't just something that businesses or quote unquote importers pay. If you're having an item shipped to you from overseas, you are the importer.
Yeah. So the next one that we hear is, okay, well, maybe what I'll just do is import the watch from another country. So, I've time to start calling my AD in, country X, Y, or Z instead of buying domestically. So tariffs and duties are assessed based on the country of origin of manufacture, not the port from which it ships. So what that means is if I buy a Chinese product currently into the United States, but it ships from France, I'm still subject to 145% tariff plus duty. If I ship a French watch from China, I'm subject to a 10% tariff plus duty. So it's about where the product is made and not where it ships from. And I'll also add, some of these things are a little bit more nuanced than just wristwatch, because now United States Customs and Border Patrol requires a breakdown of the components. So what that means, for example, is if a watch has a Swiss movement, that will be dutied at the movement rate of the value of the movement plus the 10% tariff. But if it has a Chinese-made case, you'll be paying the duty on the case plus 145% value on that component. And part of the reason why I point that out is when people start adding numbers up and say, 10% is 10% on a cost basis of an MSRP, there's no situation where that would be 100% accurate per se if the watch had a proper watch worksheet breaking down the components. It might be more than that, is what I'm getting at, depending on where the componentry was manufactured.
Yeah, and a watch worksheet.
Is that a word?
Yeah, I think so. A watch worksheet is a sheet that the exporter fills out and they give it to the customs broker, and that could be FedEx, DHL, or maybe you have your own customs broker. And they use the information in that worksheet you give them to literally input the values of everything in the order and all the components, like Asher was saying. So it's a detailed form that documents all this stuff for customs.
I'll let you take this hot potato, Gabe.
Yeah. Okay. Your point though about that 10% increase, I think, relates to this next myth, which is there is a myth out there that, if there's a 10% tariff or a 31% tariff or whatever it is, watch prices will increase 10% or 31%. And that's not necessarily true. If we're just talking about tariffs here, the way that tariffs are assessed is not based on the ultimate retail value of something, but it's based on the importer's cost. So for instance, if I'm importing a watch from Switzerland, we pay obviously a different price for that watch. We pay a wholesale price that's different from the retail price or the MSRP of the watch. We are taxed on and dutied or tariffed on the wholesale price that we pay. So that wholesale price is usually some percentage of retail. So generally, let's just make up an example here. Let's say our wholesale cost on a watch is 60% of the retail price. We're just paying that 10% tariff, or not just, but we're paying that 10% tariff on that price, on that wholesale price, on 60% of the retail value. So if we were then to pass on the cost to the customer, the price, and we'll do an example in our next section here, wouldn't raise a full 10 percentage points necessarily, because again, we're paying that tariff on a lower cost of goods for us.
Right. But this is an important thing to know for you as a consumer. If you're buying a $10,000 watch from a retailer, as Gabe just described, the impact of the tariff and the duty combined is a little bit softer for a whole host of reasons we'll go into, but not least of which being that the cost basis on which the tariff is charged is lower.
It's lower. Yeah.
If you are a consumer importing a product, you're importing it at full retail
then
price.
Then your cost does go up 10%.
Quite significantly.
Yeah,
so one really important distinction here is it is, in this current economic reality, significantly more affordable as a client to buy through an authorized dealer because of the advantage of the tax being charged at the cost basis that the importer, i.e. the dealer, is bringing it in. Now,
not only that, our cost is lower, so we pass on, there's less tariff cost passed on to the customer. The other thing is, we just pointed out a lot of the bureaucracy and the headaches involved in importing, whether it's watch worksheets, customs brokers, shipping, all that stuff. The retailer takes that all off your hands. You will never need to fill out a dreaded watch worksheet if you buy a watch from us. It will be on your doorstep the next morning.
100%.
So the final two myths we need to tackle in much greater detail. And these are really going to be the next two kind of segments of the podcast today. The first one is brands are just using this, as in using this tariff situation, as another excuse to raise prices. These are just typical price increases that we always see from brands, and now they're using the tariffs as a scapegoat. This is kind of like what people would talk about with greedflation. Businesses were raising prices because inflation was going on. It was a convenient excuse. That's not happening here, and we have an entire section we're going to go into next about exactly how the industry is trying to navigate this, how they're thinking about it, how they're dealing with these tariffs. That should hopefully address that myth, but that's a big one. The other one is, well, this is good, and this is going to support American watchmaking. And while I can definitively say that previous myth is not true, this myth about this being good for American watchmaking is really complicated and deserves some discussion. So we're going to get into that in kind of the final segment we tackle today. Let's start then, and let's go next to the industry response to all this. So we just laid all this out. We busted some myths. If you want the details, check out that awesome Teddy Baldassare video. But let's talk about how the industry is really thinking about this, responding to this. We work, like I said, with 13 different brands here. We talk to many more brands about this kind of stuff on a daily basis. Obviously, we have, as an importer, we have a lot to sort of wrangle with and think about ourselves. In some cases, we're one of the only retailers for the brands we carry, or the only retailer in the U.S. So U.S. pricing really sits on our shoulders to a large extent. And I can say that across all those brands, the responses are all different, but I can tell you every brand and us too, we are doing everything we humanly can to avoid passing on the full cost of these tariffs and currency exchange fluctuations to customers. That doesn't mean prices won't increase. In many cases, they're going to increase, but they will do so far less than simply passing on these tariffs and these currency exchange rates.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's critical to understand there is just a simple reality about the margins of the business. And I won't go into specific numbers because it does vary by brand. But the thing folks do need to understand is this is not the same as luxury clothing, for example, with a 200x markup or 300x markup, where there is arguably space for 10% or currency fluctuation to be absorbed. This industry operates on much, much, much smaller margins. So I want to just, as best I can, hammer home the point that the money that is currently being allocated for tariffs and duties and currency fluctuation is coming out of the pockets of watchmakers, agents and importers, retailers, and you. It's not money that was there to be taken. So it's a really important that when you think about how a brand is approaching this, what they're trying to do is juggle really two things. They want to make sure that the end user price for their product is still compelling, so that when somebody thinks about buying it, the price is not so out of whack with the product. And the second is, and this is really important should these tariffs lift, is that even if the tariffs lift, that doesn't necessarily mean we will see prices come back down immediately. And that's because of not just the currency flux that we spoke about before, but also the fact that we're in a period of time where there's not a lot of clarity about how this is going to impact the global economy, and also some unpredictability with the choices being made. And as a result, some, if not most brands, may keep their pricing where it is, even if we go back to a 0% tariff situation, because they want to hedge and protect themselves.
I just want to back up what you said with a little bit of data, because I think
Please.
It's helpful. You know, there's this perception like there's plenty of room within the margins. Forget retailers for a second, of these, particularly these large luxury holding companies, to just eat this and wait and see and all that sort of stuff. So let's look at some numbers. We can start with Richemont Group. This is a luxury group. Now, granted, there are categories within Richemont that are in fashion, fine leather goods, areas outside of watchmaking, but Richemont predominantly has watchmaking brands. In terms of, you look at the total number of their maisons, most of them are in watchmaking. So last year, in their last annual report, Richemont had a net profit margin of 11.4%.
Globally or domestically?
Globally. Swatch Group. This is a company that is an entirely watch-focused company. So in their last annual report, ending in December of 2024, they had a net profit margin of 3.3%. So the ability, and you know, they're way more focused on watches than Richemont is. They're exclusively focused on watches. This gives you an idea of how little wiggle room there is when you start talking about a 10% tariff and a 9% change in currency exchange rates. There's just not a lot of room. Now, you could, of course, argue these companies could cut costs. They don't need to spend so much money on marketing and partnerships or who knows what. And that's true. And I'm sure these companies will look at this.
That argument, then you could also say that they could go underwater very quickly because the demand would dry up.
But my point is, I think there's a perception, and the industry doesn't help with this perception. It perpetuates it, that this is an industry of abundance and wealth and luxury, but the realities of the business will tell you something quite different. I also think in terms of just a retailer's ability to absorb this. So in a lot of cases, like we said, this part of the solution here, and I think we can talk about some of the solutions we're seeing in general terms. But you know, if the brands need to feel some of the pain, the retailers need to feel some of the pain. The retailers have thin margins as well. So I looked into Watches of Switzerland and their net profit margin from their last annual report, similar to the Swatch Group, actually. Watches of Switzerland had a 3.84% profit margin for their last annual report. So the retailers, just like these brands, there isn't a ton of margin to give up or to absorb these kinds of changes. Yet they're doing everything that they can.
Yeah, and I want to point out one other number before we move on again, and not because I'm trying to drive like a whole lot of empathy here for Watches of Switzerland, but frankly, I think we should have some because one of the largest brands that Watches of Switzerland retails is Rolex. Rolex has split the margin across all of the various individuals that we described earlier. But what they've also done is that earlier this year, they took an additional 1% off a relatively tight margin to begin with. I believe it was 36% gross margin on Rolex.
Well, I just want to source this stuff because sourcing this stuff is important. This came from Screw Down Crown. So this was reported by King Flum, his Screw Down Crown newsletter, where he gets into how Rolex is tackling this.
Yeah. So working with Fahim's data there, if we knock that down another 2% for a total of 3%, think about the number we just shared with you about Watches of Switzerland. They're operating on a 3% margin.
They're operating on a 3.84% margin, and Rolex has lowered their margin on Rolex 3%.
So that is wild.
Sure, but let's go through the numbers for Rolex,
please,
because these numbers we're sharing on the diminished margin now for Rolex dealers this year are in the context of Rolex's solution to the tariffs and to this economic environment. And so in particular, Rolex prices in the United States are going up about 3% on average. It does
3% to the consumer.
3% to the consumer, that's right. It does vary based on the watch, but generally like steel watches are going up about 3%. Gold watches, I think there's more demand in uncertain economic times generally for gold. So gold watches are going up, I think, about 6%.
And that's because of the cost of the raw material.
So let's just think about everything we just laid out there. We've got a 10% tariff regime in the United States. We've got 9 percentage point increase in the value of the Swiss franc relative to the dollar. Yet the prices are only going up 3%. Now, there's been a lot of discussion online, as we said in the myth section, like this is just a standard Rolex price increase. They're greedy. They're just doing this because they can, and now this is convenient. And there's
in fact, this is the opposite of greed.
Yeah, if the dealers are losing about 3 percentage points of margin, if Rolex is increasing MSRP on watches about 3%, that tells us that Rolex is actually eating a not insignificant share of the costs associated with the duties and with the currency exchange. And in Rolex's case, they do pay the duties and the currency exchange because they ship the watches from Rolex in Switzerland to their business entity in the United States. So Rolex is the importer in the United States. They pay that tariff bill. And then presumably there's the retailers in the US paid them, Rolex USA, in dollars. And then Rolex USA, through whatever fancy banking and financial engineering they have, pays Rolex in Switzerland then in Swiss francs. So Rolex is probably absorbing, if not most of these changes, their fair share, or certainly more than their fair share.
I think the other reason that this can be a diminished increase relative to what people would think is that the cost that Rolex imports that product in as their own manufactured good is at a significantly lower cost than the wholesale price of the watch, because they're likely importing those watches at some form of production cost,
right,
which is, of course, a fraction of the total cost of the watch because it doesn't include the total overhead and profit margins that are built into a wholesale price.
That is true, but they do then need to pay taxes.
Correct.
Because they're bringing it in at a lower cost, selling it at a higher cost to their dealers. They're making a profit in the U.S. Again, I don't know what sort of accounting and financial engineering is happening over there, but presumably they're paying a tax to the U.S. government on their profit from that lower import cost. So when we look at that 3% price increase from Rolex, I think it's important to just compare it to some back of the envelope math and look at what would it cost if a watch brand and a retailer just decided to wholesale pass all of these increased tariff and foreign exchange costs onto the end consumer. So we're going to do an example here of a watch that costs $10,000. So watch X is a $10,000 watch retail. And let's say that watch has a 40% margin for the sake of argument here. The retailer is buying that watch from the brand for $6,000. That's the cost of the retailer. In this case, let's say the retailer is the one doing the import here. So now that $6,000 watch that they're importing has an added tariff. There's an additional 10% in tariffs that get assessed to that watch. So now that watch costs them another $600 to bring into the country. Then there's also this challenge of the retailer is buying this watch in Swiss francs from the brand, and they need dollars to pay for that watch in Swiss francs. They need to convert their dollars to Swiss francs. Well, Swiss francs just got 9% more expensive. So that adds an additional $540. They need another $540 to make up that difference in Swiss francs. So now the cost to that retailer of this watch has gone up $1,140. So a watch that previously, say, ballpark cost them $6,000 as their cost of goods sold, now costs them $7,140. And for argument's sake, let's say the retailer just said that $1,140, we're just going to take that and add it back to the MSRP. We're just going to say our MSRP was originally $10,000. It now costs us another $1,140. That $10,000 watch in today's regime is now an $11,140 watch. That is an 11.4% price increase. So when you look at the price increases you're seeing from, not just from Rolex, I think Patek Philippe has been reported as well. Omega's been reported. A number of the swatch brands are doing different price increases. I don't know that I've seen any that are as high as 11.4%.
If we pull back from all of this, essentially what we're saying to you is you have an industry comprised of the entire supply chain that is doing what they can to mitigate the impact of these new taxes on end user customers. The price increases that are happening are not consistent because not every business is the same. But the one thing that is consistent across the line is that everybody wants to see the United States remain a significant collecting market. And for this to remain a significant collecting market, the industry acknowledges that it needs to do something to mitigate the financial impact. I'll tell you one thing that we're doing, which is we've decided that for everyone who's placed an order with us on a watch and put money down on it as a deposit, we're going to honor the price at which that customer bought that watch. And that means that for Collective, we're going to make, in some cases, a meaningfully less amount of money than we would have before. But when we think about how we want to be treated as customers, and when we think about the relationships that we have with clients, we thought that moving the cheese, even if it's not our fault or the brand's fault, still really stinks, especially when we're talking about very expensive watches. So we've made the decision as a business to take it on the chin, even frankly more, by honoring old pricing. But we think that that's important.
Honoring old pricing for pre-orders. Someone
Correct.
Purchased a watch 6 months ago or maybe longer at a particular price before any of this was a twinkle in anyone's eye. And, in many cases, the price will be different now. And we're going to honor that price. It's just the right thing to do.
We think so. But I also understand why some brands may not be able to do that for all of the reasons that we just described. All right. So let's pivot to the other major topic here, which is if we zoom all the way back out and we assume a good faith argument on tariffs, the purpose of a tariff, presumably, is to protect domestic industry, right? Going back to that reference I made to, say, the automotive industry. The thing about that is there is no American watch industry. There was. And if you want to buy into the good faith argument and say that manufacturing is something that we want to do in the United States, and again, I'm just defining the argument as it's being made. Okay, but in order to do that, there is a very complex ecosystem of education, of talent and skill, and of course, machinery and development within the United States that needs to be built. So in other words, infrastructure that would take decades upon decades upon decades to build. Maybe not, that's a bit much, but at least a decade to build, to just create the talent, create the pipeline, buy the equipment and the raw materials, et cetera, and so forth. Now, we are huge proponents of American watchmaking here at Collective. It's the reason why Josh Shapiro and the J.N. Shapiro brand is something that we've been retailing since virtually the very first days of Collective. But even Josh will tell you that even if he were to scale his production and make something that was a more serially produced watch, we're not talking about industry here. We're still talking about very boutique product.
Yeah, so just to be clear, Josh Shapiro currently is the only watchmaker who is making a fully American-made watch. Now, fully American-made watch. The standard for what is American-made is much higher than the standard for things that are Swiss-made or standards that other countries have for what could be considered made in their country. United States, pretty much all of the components of a product need to come from within the United States. And Josh Shapiro is currently the only person making a watch. It's the Resurgence, where all of the components are coming from within the United States. And that is, generally speaking, about an $80,000 watch.
On average.
And that's because we just don't have the industry here. So if you need to find a ruby, or if you need a bridge or a screw or a pinion and you need to make it in yourself or in this country, the cost of doing it is just going to be a lot higher. Most American watch brands, and there's a spectrum. So if you say Josh Shapiro and the Resurgence is at one end of American watchmaking, in that spectrum, you have everything from brands who are based and designed in the U.S., whose watches are made overseas. So these are, a lot of micro brands would fall into this category. The brand and the business is here, but the watchmaking and the assembly, everything happens in another country. There are, however, some brands that fall in the middle. There are brands where the brand is based here, components come from a mix of countries, and the assembly happens in the United States. In all of these cases, including Josh's, which we should talk about, tariffs have a negative impact on these businesses. They increase the costs for these businesses. So certainly you can see how, hey, if I'm having all my watches made and assembled in another country, obviously that's clear. If I'm doing assembly here, but all my components come from another country, of course you can see how that increases your costs. But you actually, Asher, pointed out something really interesting to me, and it came from another category. How do tariffs negatively impact a business that is doing all of its manufacturing in this country?
So I love music. I'm also a guitar player. And one of my favorite guitar YouTube channels is this guy, Rhett Shull. So anyone listening here is a guitar player, go check out Rhett Shull. Generally speaking, he doesn't talk about this kind of stuff, but he opened my eyes to something which hadn't occurred to me, but is an incredibly good point. He said he was talking about visiting the Gibson factory, famous for making Les Pauls, for example, and SGs, and the Fender factory, famous for making the Stratocaster, the Telecaster, the Jazzmaster, like all of those iconic American guitars. And he points out these are actually American-made products with American-made components. The wood is domestic. The tuners are domestic. Heck, even the strings are made domestically. So,
this sounds like the Nirvana for American watchmaking.
Absolutely.
This is what we want. Yeah.
Proper American industry. So the prices aren't going to go up, right? Wrong. Why? Well, the halogen lights that light the factory right down here in Los Angeles for Fender, those aren't made in America. The hundreds of thousands of feet of sandpaper that is used in finishing guitar bodies and necks, that's not made in America. The CNC machines that carve those necks, those aren't made in America. And the thing you got to ask yourself, and this is the sort of the rhetorical question about this, is why would we want to make those things in America if we are able to get them from somebody who already makes them effectively and helps us champion American industry? So I think it's an important thing when we say, like, well, because I've seen a lot of comments online. They're like, well, this is the perfect opportunity for someone to make an affordable American movement. And the problem with that kind of a statement is, I mean, sure, but if we were going to do that, what CNC machines are you going to use?
Yeah. I went to Josh Shapiro's workshop the other day. What an experience. But he recently took delivery. He has multiple CNC machines. Some of them are American. So he has some Haas machines made proudly here in Oxnard, California. But I would assume that, again, a lot of the components for those Haas CNC machines are coming from other countries. But two of the biggest, the most expensive, the most significant, and the workhorse CNC machines he has are from Kern, a German company. Mm-hmm. These are multi-million dollars worth of CNC machines. He's got electric lathes from Citizen.
Yeah.
That comes from Japan.
And I want to point something out about this heavy equipment, which a lot of people don't understand too. When we talk about equipment like that, as Gabe pointed out, like these are some of these are multi-million-dollar products.
Yeah.
Now, when you buy something like that, you generally don't buy it. You either lease it or you finance it. So if you're financing it, that means the cost of the import is built into the base amount of money that you're financing, which means that you're going to be paying even more because that tariff is built into the finance, the amount of money that you're financing.
Regardless of how you look at it, the tariffs make it more expensive to manufacture in the United States. Now, we should consider doing an episode on what is required to restore watchmaking in America. And that's separate from tariffs. Like, let's forget about the current events and what's happening and all of the things we just talked about. And I'd love to have Josh on if you'd join us.
We should totally have Josh on.
Anyone who's doing watch manufacturing in the United States, to just talk in pretty plain and practical terms about what is required to restore watchmaking in this country
at scale.
Because I think it would be eye-opening, and he certainly will have figured out and learned way more about what actually goes into this stuff than you or I could ever conceive of. So let's do that.
Totally. All right. So as we bring this home, a couple of things to note. Again, recognizing this is April 30th and things change on a day-to-day basis. So a couple days ago, the Swiss president, who interestingly is also the finance minister of the country, announced that she has been working and her team has been working aggressively with the United States to come to some form of a agreement that will hopefully have a better outcome than certainly a better outcome than the originally proposed 31% so-called reciprocal tariff, and hopefully better than a 10% one. I think as we look to the outlook of the future, as more certainty enters the market, and as more predictability enters the currency market, over time, I think there will be a much clearer and more stable path forward.
Look, you're right. There will be more certainty. And right now we are in the thick of a period of a lot of change. It's April 30th today. This happened April 2nd when we were at Watches and Wonders. And there's been a lot of change to navigate the last month. I've been really pleasantly surprised by the stability the industry has shown, the thoughtfulness the industry has shown. It's also very clear that the industry values the American market and American customers. We talked about all the things that the industry itself is doing to try to absorb as much of this as possible and to maintain a steady hand. It's because they value the customers in this country and the enthusiasts in this country. I think the industry itself has shown a remarkable amount of stability. Also, collectors have shown a remarkable amount of stability. April, I think, was our biggest retail month ever, which is pretty remarkable if you consider the amount of change happening. So yeah, it's true. We're going to move to a period of more clarity and more stability. I did not know that about the president of Switzerland. That's good news. But even now, in this period of change and maybe less certainty than where we ultimately get to, I've been really positively surprised and encouraged by the stability the industry itself has shown.
I think that's a good place for us to call it.
All right. Well, thank you so much for listening. This, of course, is Open Work. It's a production of Collective Horology. You can find us and learn more about our open house event at collectivehorology.com. And to get in touch with your suggestions, your feedback, your questions, or your math corrections, just email podcast@collectivehorology.com.